Hello, Jim.
Good to see you, man. How are you? I'm good.
Back at you, man. We should spring for some animation someday. When we make it big, we'll get some animation in the intro versus the Canva created YouTube card that we're
Well, there's a
defaulting
guy I
towards.
watch that does Nick Hodge. He does movie reviews of historical movies on YouTube as to their accuracy to the actual historical event. Don't get him started on Mel Gibson, by the way. Um, and he's got his own animated guy version of him that does the intros. It's pretty cool.
Maybe
Yeah,
someday we'll get an agent to do that for us. There's probably an
there's an
agent for
agent for
that.
everything.
There's an
Yeah.
agent for everything now. Yeah, that's right. So let's talk about the product strategy series, of which this will be an installment in.
You are correct, sir. To be Ed McMahon from the old Johnny Carson show.
So we like to say that in our companies, the product strategy is the corporate strategy. Jim, why do we say that?
Well, small mid-market software companies, they're typically a one product. Forget features for a second. They're a one product, company. And so how goeth the product? How goeth the business? I mean, if the product is really bad, you can have a great corporate strategy. It doesn't really mean anything. Whereas opposed to like a large conglomerate, their corporate strategy could be different than their individual product strategies. But when you're an N of one, you are where you are.
100%. And if you spend any time with us, we've got a couple frameworks that we come back to time and time again. So, as the first installment in our newly christened product strategy series, we wanted to hit what I would say is the centerpiece of our product practice, which is all about something called the Ansoff matrix.
Clever name. Named after the Russian guy who invented it, 1957. I think it was actually originally um, laid out for literally agricultural products or agriculture. But it was a science and mathematic, and it's a good framework for understanding how you take your products to market. Essentially, now we've adapted it to some degree to fit our needs.
Yeah. So before we get into what the Ansoff matrix is, which we will definitely cover today, we're going to talk about why we focus so much on product strategy, some of the things that we find inside of founder owned businesses. And if you work inside of a founder owned business or you started one yourself, hopefully you'll recognize some of these factors because we run into them a lot. And this is definitely a situation where, I don't know, I like to say the obstacle is the way. Like if you identify these obstacles, get them out of your way, good things start to happen, both in terms of your product development cycle and the growth that hopefully follows it. So I don't know, Jim, with that, should we get
Let's
into
do
it?
it, man.
So let's set the stage. How do you want to set the
Well, let's set it
stage?
from our. I mean, there are concepts that apply to other companies and other industries as well. I mean, what we know is middle market software companies. So we apply it to our model, but I think you can extrapolate this, as we go through it. For us, we are focused on, buying founder owned lower middle market software companies, typically less than 20 million in revenue when we buy them, right? So this primarily focuses on our experiences, but there are parallels for industrials or manufacturing or healthcare companies or consumer markets. They don't follow the exact pattern, but by product, they probably do. I mean, the one big exception would be in a small one product company. And you always have to remind people a bunch of features in a product is still a product, right? So it's a one product company, which most of our portfolio companies are a one product company. They follow this pattern pretty close in our experience. So I think as we go through this,
Yeah.
we'll use some several examples of software companies, both large and small, across the history of the software market that may give you some grounding of, oh, I see why you're saying that. Like I remember that company. Yeah, Paul will keep me honest because I'll tend to use references from the '80s, which is some of these companies started before most of the listeners were born. So I'll try and keep myself current. I'm not going to do back in Lotus development in 1978. I'll avoid that. Now we'll also, where appropriate, and this is somewhat unique to technology or the software marketplace, we'll reference technology shifts that have had an impact, right? So one thing that's very different from some other industries as compared to software is external events can cause changes in your strategy. For example, the move to client server from just terminal based applications was a shift, an industry shift that caused products to fall up and down and move, change product strategy heavily. browse going from client server to the browser was yet another change. Mobile was yet another change, and of course, we're all now in the world of AI. An AI agent can solve anything. The landing of AI or the excitement around AI is causing some agita in product strategy because companies that have a roadmap ahead of them or a plan are now having to deal with the fact that there's a technology that customers are saying could be useful in the application, and how do you get it in that application, right? So external events can have a fairly strong impact at our size companies.
Yeah, and I also say like your last bullet around this is not just how it affects the decisions you make vis-a-vis strategy and the products that you build, but it's also like if this doesn't immediately devolve into something you're doing different or new or better in sales or marketing, you're probably doing it wrong.
Yep. I think that's your tagline.
Cool.
Paul usually ends with, if you're not doing X, Y, Z, you're probably doing it wrong.
I gotta check myself on my
check
my
yourself before you wreck
things.
yourself, my friends. So I think one, I think we referenced this in probably a statistically significant number of our presentations. But if you haven't read any of Jeffrey Moore's books, his seminal work, Crossing the Chasm, which is basically about how software markets develop and how companies play in that, is a great understanding of how software companies and software markets work. And there's loads of applications to lots of other marketplaces, right? And I'm not going to try and summarize the book here. I highly recommend you get it. But one of the key things that he laid out in Crossing the Chasm, he referenced this by using other metaphors, but typically in any software market, as it begins to settle in, this is not a nascent stage. So I think you might actually not see this exactly in a venture market. So in a new market where lots of companies are starting out, there probably isn't a market leader, or by definition, there isn't, unless they're the only game in town. But as the market begins to mature, these things settle out, right? And typically where you end up with a market leader that has the bulk of the customers and the bulk of the revenues, right? So on our little XY matrix here, it's got high market share and very low number of companies, right? Because it's typically an N of one. The market leader is the market leader, right? Now, occasionally as the markets grow, that might be slightly clustered before somebody breaks away, but here we're looking at a little bit of a mature marketplace. So, for example, if we were in the 2000s, the market leader for relational databases would have been Oracle, and next tier down, you have smaller companies that are challengers to the market leader. They may never actually overtake the market leader, but they're certainly in range, right? Now, typically what's different about those companies is, if they're doing it, I guess, right or properly, is they've got some differentiator to the market leader. Because, a pitch of, hey, there's the best, now try the rest, doesn't really work here. So typically the next layer down, they specialize in something. It might be a vertical specialty. So for example, Sybase really targeted the financial services market. And they did it through, the addition of stored procedures in their product. So they were really focused on the financial services vertical. If you were competing across the market, they didn't do as well, but in that marketplace, they were dominating. They could even beat Oracle in that space, right? You might be the innovator. So you're the new guy adding new features. And Formix tried this approach when they added objects in their database to kind of differentiate themselves. Or you could be the low price guys. That was Progress Software, was like, hey, we're way less expensive than some of those other guys. Those are all valid, sort of strategies. But at this layer down, you got to have sort of a strategy, a differentiator, because you just can't compete on, we're number two, hooray, right? And then below that, depending on the market, you may have a bunch of like small one-off solutions, small independent. And of course, P guys love those guys too. They wouldn't be a platform that you could buy, but they would certainly be a tuck-in acquisition, for example, right? And they may not have a theme. They may be focused on a particular geography, or they may be focused on an operating system that's not used much anymore and is not that popular. It could be on an alternate, if we were talking about a mobile app, it may be something that's not Android and not iOS, but something else, that kind of thing. But you need to understand as a company where you are. Now, for us, we never own the market leader. We've occasionally ended up as the market leader at the end of the day. And so when you look at this, for example, if we revisited the Oracle decision, the Oracle positioning in the 2000s, they were the market leader. Sybase and Formix, MySQL, I guess, was sort of there. There were a few other guys and then a bunch of small independent players. Today, that's entirely flipped. The market leader is MySQL. Postgres is fairly tight on its tails. Oracle, SQL Server, are not necessarily the market leaders anymore. So this can change over time, which Moore didn't envision when he first did this. Because I don't think when he first wrote this book, we were only 20 years into the independent software marketplace, so we didn't have time for the full maturity. But as these markets mature, players can move around. The key thing for us is, where are you in this market, right? And it's really important. Remember for a minute that if you happen to be the market leader, there may be some differences as we get further on in this presentation. Typically, we're buying somebody, or we own a company that's in that middle segment there, right? That's a challenger with some unique way they look at the market, whether it's a vertical focus, some features that are different, operating systems that they run, pricing, but there's some reason that they're basically targeting a different approach than the market leader.
Yeah, and typically there's kind of an insurgent mindset that you can weaponize a little bit, because the market leader doesn't tend to have the highest NPS or the happiest customers or the most vertical specific workflows. Like, there's lots of advantages that you can have as, somebody on the middle or bottom right hand part of this page. And I think a lot of what we do is we kind of look for the products that are very high NPS, that do the job very well, that not enough people have heard of, but they've carved out a nice position for themselves underneath the market leader, and they need help paying off that niche that they've helped to create.
Yeah, one thing I think that's a reference point off that I think is important as you're sort of figuring out where you are in the marketplace, and sort of what whether you can attack the market leader or how you grow your market, right? And you may not be as focused on taking away market share from the market leader in a market that's still expanding, right? So if it's an expanding universe, you may not care. In a place where there's no greenfield left, like everybody's got one, and you're stealing from competition, well, then it becomes much messier. One of the key things is understanding how sticky your individual product is, right? So one of the reasons that it took a long time to dethrone Oracle was ripping out your relational database and replacing it with a different one. It's not so easy. SQL is SQL, yep, except for all the extensions that Oracle provided that you use that don't have an equivalent in the other platform. Same thing with an ERP system. Now, as you start to get to browser-only applications like a CRM application, not as hard. It's easier to rip out. And so, if I was a database player going after Oracle in the 2000s, I think it would be a bad strategy. I think I could overtake them. It's more about building up my niche or building up my verticals. When you're talking about a SaaS-based platform where the switching costs are relatively low, you can overtake the market leader, and that will play into your product strategy, because you've got a legitimate shot where you may not if the product is particularly difficult to rip out.
Yeah. So I think one of the takeaways from this page is, like, you kind of need to play a different game than the market leader. And part of coming up with your product strategy is clarifying how you're going to be different and how you're going to commit to that bit. Is that fair?
And it's also fair to have a realistic assessment of, you often get those guys are terrible. Like, yeah, probably not. They get to be the market leader somehow, right? And it's not just sales. So be honest with yourself and what your strengths and weaknesses are, and we have a realistic, place to play, right? It's like the 6-foot guy that can't shoot saying, I'm going to make it to the NBA. You might make it to an NBA game if you buy a ticket, but you ain't playing,
Yeah. So we promised we'd get to it. This is probably my favorite product framework. This slide is in a lot of decks that we share with our product teams, and it's a thing we keep coming back to whenever we talk to engineering or product teams. So why do we use this? What is it for? Why is it so important?
Yeah, why don't you talk about it? So this is the generic Ansoff matrix, theoretically, right? So let's tag team on this one. It's a 2x2, which we're required to do, basically based on Paul's contracts.
By law.
Any ex-consultant, you have to have a 2x2.
My demands have to be met.
And so, on the left, top to bottom, you've got the markets, and we call this, it's a market you play in. We further define a market segment. Well, we'll talk about that. And across the top is either a current product that you offer for sale or some new product that you're thinking of buying or envisioning, right? And so it's 4 quadrants, and they're colored to the degree of difficulty. So if you're trying to take your current product and get more penetration in your current market, that's just market penetration, and that's green because it should be easy to do unless your product's really bad, right? And we'll talk about what that means in terms of how to actually grow in that space, because there's more details of that, but that's relatively easy. If you're trying to take your current product into a new market, first go back and read all of Jeffrey Moore's books, because this is kind of the bowling alley 101, right? That can be
Yep.
that can be difficult. If you're out of room in your current market segment, right? There's no greenfield left. You may have no choice. What's different here, maybe there may be some differences. You may need to make changes to the product, but you're certainly making a lot of changes to your marketing and sales and how you approach those prospects, because they're different, right? And if it's very similar, so if I was selling into banks and I want to sell into insurance companies, there's some similarities there. It's not identical, but community banks probably right on target, but insurance is pretty close. If I was selling to financial service companies and now I decided to take my new product into manufacturing, that's a bigger jump, right? And so this one's yellow. And if you're one of the niche players, in terms of the market, this is something that you may have to do. You may have to go, if you're a niche player, you may have to go to another niche and dominate there as well. And there's a history of companies that have done that pretty well, right? On the lower right, you're basically taking, in your current market, the same people you're selling to, the same market you're selling to, you bring in a new product to market, right? Not a new feature, not a change to a feature, but an entire new module, you call it, right? So, maybe you sell a CRM system for dentists today, and you're thinking of adding billing and invoicing to that. That's a new product, right? That you're selling into your current market. Whether you make it yourself or whether you buy something else, try and bolt it to yours, that's harder. The degree of difficulty is harder, because in particular, when your existing market customers already have a solution there. Yeah, they may like your CRM solution, but they already have a billing solution and invoicing. So replacing it, you could make the argument, the tighter integration between your CRM and invoicing and billing makes the whole thing easier. Maybe that's true, but it's still more difficult, right? You don't know that space you don't know those features, functions as well. And whether you make it or buy it, it's a more difficult sell than just taking something that's a natural extension to your existing product, right? And this is the jobs to be done guys will look at this and they love this approach, but why it's yellow to us is it's harder. And, we will want to be sure we've squeezed all the juice out of the lemon in the lower left before we, embark on the right. Now, the last quadrant, new market, new product. This is what's called the red quadrant. This should never happen in one of our portfolio companies.
Do not touch. Do not
However,
pass go. Yeah.
Go back to the Jeffrey Moore, chart. Oracle absolutely and positively went after the ERP market and n number of other markets. They went after business intelligence. They went after ERP. Why? Because they were sort of saturated in their current market with their current products. And the only way for them to grow was to steal share, which was really hard to do because databases are hard to rip out. But, they did see business intelligence getting hot. They did see that people were no longer writing their own homegrown ERP systems, but buying ERP systems. So that's true diversification. Whether they built it or bought it, and they had a history of doing both, as have Salesforce, any Microsoft, any large company has done this. And it's a valid strategy and a reasonable play for those folks because they got the time and resources to go after it. It's not a great play for smaller companies like ours.
Yeah, and so if you're looking at this for the first time, there's two ways I think about this page. One is it's a nudge for where you should be spending your time in your product and your engineering department. Like if you have the list of all the things that you're working on and all the things you're thinking about building, most of them should probably be in the green box because you're either strengthening your position in the current market with a product that people love, or you're bringing it up to the level of the competition where maybe you have fallen behind. So one is it should be a guideline for how you're spending your time. And two, it's a risk management framework. Like if you are banking on building a product in the top right, where it's a new product in a new market, and you're not able to say, yeah, we've done this before and yeah, we know how it works, that's a riskier product strategy than bolstering a product that you already have in a market that you already know. So another two angles to take on this. You are how you spend your time. This is a great way to prioritize and to check yourself on how you're spending your time in product and engineering. It's also a measure of how wobbly or how risky your product strategy might be based on everything in your roadmap and where it fits on this
Yeah,
page.
it also should give you some pause for the inbound you get from your customers and prospects too, right? Because if you're focused on the lower left quadrant, you'll occasionally get your customers trying to drag you into an adjacent market,
Yep.
right? Like some insurance company or some, manufacturer sees your product that you sell in financial services. Like, oh, we love it we can take it just as it is. It's perfect for us, but it's not going to be just as it is, right? So be careful as you get sucked over that line. Don't do it unintentionally, right? If you're going to make that jump, make that jump. Same thing on, the customer saying, yeah, I really love it. If I had a billing system for me, you need to spend a lot of time vetting that before you should jump down that path, right? You could get easily sucked down that path by a customer or prospect that's way more forward thinking than your current markets. Now, the other thing I would say that more talked about that you should overlay this on, you should also understand your customers. Are they kind of leading edge customers or laggards in terms of what they buy? And that will also determine how fancy you get with adding products and features and functions, right? There's just some industries that tend to go slower than others. And I'm not going to say that, look, as examples, you often hear like healthcare, is slower to adopt things, or insurance companies are slower to adopt things. Just, I'm not saying either one of those are true. There's colloquial evidence that says maybe they are, but if you're saying, hey, I'm gonna lay on this, AI based mobile thing on top of everything else, and most of your customers tend to be laggard adopters of technology, I don't care how good it is, they're probably not going to accept it.
So the question is, all right, that makes sense at a conceptual level. I like the matrix, but like what are the things that you would be doing in each box? Like how can we make these real? Like when we talk about doing product stuff related to your current market and related to the current products that you have today, what might be on that
So
list?
let's look at it in terms of what are you trying to do, right? What you're trying to do here is you're trying to get, more share of your customer's wallet, if at all possible. Ideally, you'd like to steal some customers from your competitors, if that makes sense, right? You would like to keep your competitors from stealing your customers, if at all possible. And if there's an opportunity, if there's still greenfield, you want to get the non-buyers. So in some markets that are still growing, people don't have a solution for X, Y, Z, and if they don't, you're trying to capture those. So that focuses you on what are you doing around the current product, and it's not just development. So it could be you're just adding features, and those features allow you to get more users at that customer base, right? So sometimes we see our portfolio companies will have, sort of power user and then occasional user, and they'll sell occasional user, light user seats that might be read only for a cheaper price. So you add in that read only feature that allows you to sell some more seats to that existing customer. It makes the customer happy. You make some incremental revenue, and it's not a huge jump, right? Sometimes you're just beefing up a feature so you could increase or decrease prices. It's something you didn't have that it's like, hey, I'm adding this new feature in. We're likely going to see this around AI because AI is not only not cheap from an engine standpoint, but it can add to your COGS, your cost of goods sold, pretty substantially. So, I mean, I think I read today that Sam Altman was saying that the fact that people say please and thank you to ChatGPT costs them
Costs
millions
them
of
millions of
dollars, right?
bucks.
Just for the extra
Yep.
plays. So
And I'm not going
yeah,
to stop because when the AI takes over, I want to be an indoor pet. That's
yeah,
my strategy. Is I'm going to keep
I'm
being
already going to
polite.
be Kyle Reese, so let's just not like I have no illusions. There's that. Hey, is there a way to do it to increase or decrease prices? Adding in AI is going to be something that potentially has an increase in price because it's got a real cost. It's got value to the customer, but it isn't always development. You could be changing out the packaging on bundling, so you could go to gold and silver edition, right, and pull some features out, or put some new features only in the more expensive edition to get people to move to that, right? It could be buying out a competitor and just putting them into your product suite, right? So that's a product strategy decision. It's like, wow, we're all kind of even here. There's still a lot of players. This market has sorted itself out. Maybe what I should be doing is just not building new stuff, but rather buying out my competitors and figuring out what features in their system should go in ours, what things should we kill off, and how do we get those customers onto our platform to keep the cost down, right? And then last but not least, there's a reacting to technology shifts, right? So when client server went to browser, at some point there was, and these shifts can be very different. The timeline from going from client server to browser is really long. There are still some client server applications out there that customers are happy with. The addition of a mobile app on top of your platform, that had a much shorter implementation timeline. A lot of customers were hot to trot on that, fairly quickly after sort of year 2 of the iPhone, having the real app store kind of thing, right? And then AI is probably the fastest we've seen. Like, we still don't even really know how to manage AI to a large degree. And most customers at most of our companies are saying, hey, what are you doing about AI? Right. So those are, those are reactions to technology shifts that, you may not have planned for in your product strategy, but it's getting foisted upon you by the market.
Yep.
So the rest of these should be sort of warning, right? So we look at what are easy things. Look, if you're out of space in your current market segment, right? And I go with segments. So let's say you're really good at, we'll go back to our fictional dentist example. Let's say you sell a CRM to dentist office, and you do really well in offices with sort of 5 to 10 dentists, which is probably good size practice. And now you want to say, hey, let's go target the solo dentist's office, right? I'm going to argue that that's a new market, right? A lot of people say, no, you're still selling to dentists. Well, selling to the solo dentist is really different than selling to an office with 10 dentists who probably have 20 hygienists, and a complicated scheduling system. Like, it's different, right? So, we think you need to determine who your real customers are and what segment you really play in your market, because moves around that can be difficult. The typical ones we see here are new geographies. So, I sell this in North America. I want to try and sell it in Canada, or I want to sell it in Europe. It's not necessarily a no change kind of thing. You may need to deal with currencies and language, and there may be some technologies that are in use in those countries that aren't in use here that you need to integrate with. So it's not incredibly difficult, but it's not simple, right? As selling more stuff or bolting stuff onto your existing product. Ideally, what you're looking for here is minimal product changes, right? So if you start to look like you're into a 6 to 12 month project to take that current product and put it in the new market with any kind of, initial traction, you sort of better think hard before you do it.
Similar on the bottom
although
right.
It could have been darker yellow. Now we're getting to the aesthetics. Yeah.
I was gonna ask you if we should have gone amber in one of these.
It's the Nigel Tufnell. It's none more yellow. We think this. So the left side is easier completely than the right side, right? So the lower right is still easier than the upper left here, right? Because here it's everything from feature acquisitions. So are you extending your product with something that's almost a new product, right? And we see this a lot with failed venture companies. Are often they think they're a product, but they're a feature, and they get confused because it's a pretty big feature, so it looks like a product. It's harder to do these feature acquisitions, right? Places where it's a little easier, which is why it's still yellow. Sometimes you're just engineering, partner products out. For example, you may be using somebody else's GPS library. So maybe we'll go back to our dentist's example or something. Maybe you're trying to map out customers, where customers are when you do your marketing campaign, your CRM system, whatever. And you're using Google's APIs and they're getting too expensive. Hey, maybe there's a third-party company you can bring in, or you can write that piece yourself. We see this a lot. And if you read Jeffrey Moore, this is really common in a developing market, because the customers want to buy solutions, not products. And if you don't have a full solution yet, you may need to partner. But over time, so as you see somebody that was maybe in the middle of the market leader curve move up to market leader, they're almost always engineering out their partner products and bringing that in-house, so they get all the dollars and all the gross margin, and they're not handing it to prospect. But it's not simple. So a lot of people think this is super easy. We'll just replace the one the guys we were using with one we make ourselves, or a cheaper third-party one. That's not that easy. So you need to be careful. Sometimes it's just a partnership with new products. So the cheaper way to jump into this is, should we have one of our own? Or maybe what we should do is integrate into, rather than building our own billing and invoicing system, maybe we should integrate better with the one we see our customers buy a lot. And if that seems to go well, that may be a decision to pull it in house, right? So you've sort of tested the water a little bit. The key here, I think, is focus on jobs to be done. You're putting something in that's sort of a really new module, a really new product that fits in with your solution, you hope, but it's not obvious how tight it fits. You need to make sure that you know how your customers are using your product and that they will get real value out of this thing that you're going to add, right? And the danger here is you drift into the upper right, right? That you end up with a product that doesn't fit your market, that you got to go sell into a new market completely. And it's like, really? Yeah, really? And then we have really bad product strategy reviews when we hit that.
Yeah. Beware any new product pitch that starts with all we have to do is, because typically what they're talking about is drifting into the upper right when this is the shortest description of what happens in the upper right. It's also the hardest one to
That's
pull
like
off.
that. As Danny Gould says, all of the parents of his generation had a drunk phrase. His father's was, "I'll be honest with you," and you knew what was coming after was bad. When we hear all we have to do is, we get the warning, danger, Will Robinson, danger.
Yeah, that's the full 5 alarm situation.
So say no to red. We're gonna
Say
need a
no
bunch
to
of
red.
red fans that are gonna hate us now. We're gonna need all sorts of. And I think you put it all together. This is kind of what we're looking at, right? When we look at what we're asking as we look at development plans and product pipelines from our portfolio companies is we're looking to see that they know where they sit and that we're focused in the lower left quadrant with forays into the upper left or lower right. Require a lot more proof points for us to green light them, and moving into the red is highly unlikely. Now, having said that, oftentimes our companies are bought as the red. It's the bigger guy wanting to get into a new market is buying smaller software companies. So that is, they are shopping for people who are in the lower left quadrant.
Which philosophically, stay with me here, the moment the deal closes of a company that you're buying, which is technically a new product in a new market for you, they move into the green quadrant because now they're a part of your company and they're part of your current product, current market.
Yeah. Now, in some cases, that's, like, look, when you think, Oracle going into ERP, why did they move into ERP, which is a new product, new market? First of all, lots of people had money in their hand saying, can you sell me one? Number one. But number two, every ERP system had a relational database underneath it by that time. They certainly didn't back in the 80s necessarily, they made a file system based, but by the time you're in the 2000s, most of these ERP systems had, a database under the covers. And, Oracle, I think both saw it as a good market, but also as a defense strategy that, at some point, if these ERP companies get real successful, they may partner out the Oracle database for a database of their own, which SAP absolutely did when they built their own memory resident database, right? So HANA, if I'm talking about HANA, they saw HANA as a replacement for Oracle. So, your market leaders are often hunting in this category as a defensive move too.
Yeah, and I would say one of the ways we put this to work is we have product strategy reviews with every single one of our portfolio companies. The basic choreography of that product strategy review is let's talk about what you're working on and let's talk about what's most important. And a lot of the questions that we ask are an attempt to sort the various products and features that our teams are working on into these boxes and create clarity around where they sit and where the balance of work is. Is it in the green or somewhere else? And then make sure everybody feels good about that. And the good news is if you do the right work, you also discover maybe a lot more that you can build or a lot more that you can develop or a lot more you can improve in that bottom left-hand box, which kind of takes us to the first bullet on the last page. And this is not a podcast about customer research, but no good product strategy review or no good product strategy period exists without talking to customers. And so one of the biggest problems that we see in product organizations that are struggling or engineering organizations that are struggling is they are not connected enough to how customers are using the product or what else they're asking for. Is that
that's
fair?
fair. And I think It can be there's there's a little there's a lot of root causes for this. Sometimes it's a very vocal customer who you really like is trying to convince you to do something, and your job is to talk to other people that never brought this idea up to you to see what they think about it, because it could be a one-off that customer is just trying to gain leverage, in the market with. It's not applicable to other, to your other customers. Sometimes it's lazy is not the right word. It's like I thought you talked to him. No, I thought you talked to him.
Yep.
Unless it's a formal
Yep.
process, the easiest, the cheapest way to kill or create a product is to talk to your prospects and customers and find out what they think about it and would they buy it and what else are they using today that does or does not solve that problem long before you write a line of code, right? Long before.
100%.
And so this is a lot of what we focus in on. And we've got a separate episode. We'll talk about how we actually conduct a product strategy review, but that's kind of one of the key things is finding out, hey, have we talked to enough people? And that's not just customers, prospects. Larger companies end up talking to analysts like Gartner or Forrester, hey, let's get some, before we spend a lot of money on engineering here and sales and marketing to drive that product, let's make sure we're building the right thing.
Yeah, and it's just, again, I think the couple of projects that I'm most excited about that we're running this year, one, they've all started with customer research. Two, I think they've started by talking to happy customers, not customers who are mad at you. The good news is those people find you all by themselves, so you don't have to go looking for them. But if you get in touch with the customer love, if you get in touch with the customers who use your stuff every day, who recommend you to other people, and you discover where that love comes from, like one, you find obstacles that you can take out of those people's way, which is the fastest way to hire NPS, in my opinion. And two, you start to think about what a better go-to-market strategy could look like, which in my opinion, a good go-to-market strategy is just how do you clone your happiest customers? And you can't know that stuff unless you're talking to them.
Yeah, and customers have in the software business where platform is key, right? They have a vested interest in making sure that you're still around and that you're the market leader because they like you and they want to keep using you. They don't want you to disappear or have to go into a completely different market because you're getting crushed in your current market. So they have every incentive to be your cheerleaders, and they're a perfect source of information.
Yeah, and the second bullet on this page, I think I like to deliver this with some empathy. Like, building stuff is hard. Like, writing code is hard. Getting a piece of software to work in the wild for a person who's never used it is hard. And there's a couple of things because of that hard work. I would call it the last mile of any new product launch success or commercialization or whatever you want to call it. Like, one is you forget to agree in advance on what success looks like. And I think our perspective is it's less important how you define success. It's more important that you define success. And a lot of companies skip this step. You want to talk about that?
I think we both, you see this part of it, I see the part that we got it out there. You see this part more than I do. But I think a couple of things, it's setting something that is somewhat objective. And some of these things can be hard, right? So let's say you have a completely new module that you're putting a price on it. Okay, well, if you've got sales targets for that, you can produce sales targets and you can decide whether that's success or not, right? You might get too aggressive. You might be crazy in terms of how many you think, but it's you got to skew for it. You're pitching it to your customers and they're either buying it or not. That's pretty easy, right? As you start to move down, though, it gets more tricky, right? So if you put features in as a defensive move against your competitor or to make your product stickier, your customer, maybe your customer retention numbers improved, but you may not be able to attribute it to specifically this feature. So this goes back to post-release customer conversations to validate, that's a little more subjective, but you should still do it, because you may have said, hey, we did a great job. We put this new thing in there and we got more customers who are staying. And as it turned out, it was because you lowered the price or you changed packaging on something. It's nothing, or one of the competitors, completely stepped on their own toes and, shot themselves in the foot, to use multiple metaphors in the same sentence. So what you did had no effect whatsoever, right? So trying to get to something that you can actually measure, even if it's somewhat subjectively, but an honest measure to determine whether it was successful or not, right? That's hard.
Yeah, and if you're Totally. And if you're not doing the stuff on the bottom of this page, which I think is a pretty damn good last mile enablement checklist, like one, you're probably not going to be as successful as you otherwise would have. But two, you're going to be frustrated because you're not going to know whether it's the product that was the problem or it's the execution is the problem. So if you haven't brought marketing in and clarified the messaging ahead of time, if you haven't sanity checked how your sales engineers are demoing the product, or if they're just giving them the harbor tour of the, everything from the login page and everything thereafter, if your salespeople haven't proven to you as the CEO or the product leader or both that they can sell the new offering or at least answer the questions about it, and if you haven't thought about how competitors will respond or the questions that customer success is going to get, then you're not ready. And again, this is where fatigue sets in, is what I see. Is building stuff is hard, building stuff is tiring. Too many organizations out there get too tired to finish this last mile of enablement. The product launch doesn't go as well as they want it to, and then they're really confused because they can't tell whether it was a lack of preparation or they built the wrong thing. And that is a particularly frustrating flavor of confusion, both for the team and for us as investors.
I mean, years and years ago, when I worked for Ingress and the start of the relational database, we released this feature that was distributed database. So, one database could talk to another, which was fairly leading edge. Now, all databases have that feature today. It was way ahead of its time, right? So every customer we showed it to, and I don't think we did any, validation ahead of time. They all said it was really cool, but nobody really bought it. And Oracle just released a press release and some presentations that they were going to have it too in 6 months. Well, they didn't care. It's like, well, okay, if Ingress sells a lot of the stuff, we'll just put one of our own in. Nobody's going to actually leave Oracle for Ingress for this feature. And if they're going to, we're going to have plenty of time to do it, right? So that's sort of just a whole wasted opportunity. Not only the dollars and everything we threw into it, but the opportunity cost is huge. What weren't we doing that we could have been doing that would have made us more competitive?
Yeah, and I will say, as part of the product development process, you need to find strategic ways to bring the rest of the company along with what you're doing, especially the folks that are going to have to deal with the customers who go through the inevitable rough spots of using it. So that's customer success or customer support, and the people who get paid to go find the new customers to use this stuff. So that's namely sales and marketing. And I think one of the best ways to do that is game planning together about how competitors are going to respond. Like we had an example of this in the portfolio recently where we pretty significantly changed pricing and packaging on a software product of ours. And I can rewind the tape a couple months from now, or backwards from now, when we actually were thinking about this launch. And one of the most engaging conversations we had, one of the most cross-functional conversations that we had, was about that topic. It's like, hey, we know our competitors are going to take notice. We know they're going to care about this. We know they're going to be all over it. What do we think they're going to do? And what do we have to be ready with? And turns out the response hasn't been super pronounced yet. We'll see what happens. The level of interest has been higher than the magnitude of the response. But that moment where we brought product, marketing, sales, CEO together to talk about that topic, one, it was really fun. Like, that's strategy with a capital S, in my opinion. And two, it surfaced a bunch of interesting questions that we had not thought about because we were focused on just changing the element of the product itself, not about what the impact was going to be in the market.
That's there's a line in the Blues Brothers where they said next song up is one of our favorites and one of the favorites of the horn section because there's no horns in it, so they didn't have to play. Yeah, when you're changing pricing or packaging, it's one of the favorites of the product engineering organization because they typically aren't doing anything. But it is a very valid play. Yeah, changing pricing, packaging may be what you need to be more competitive rather than just jumping in to do more feature.
Yeah, especially if you're in a mature product category and you're attriting customers. Like, that should be something you should take a hard look at. It's not your only move, but I think a lot of people forget to consider that.
Yeah, and I also think the other thing they forget in the pieces of this, and you can in their closing thoughts here, when we talk about what's next. When we say, is sales prepared to sell the new offerings? There's all the little stuff like, hey, there's a drop down list box item for this new module in the CRM, so they can even say they demoed or schedule a demo. There's a SKU in the price book, so they can actually quote it. If it requires
Yeah.
license changes, the changes are in the license, right? Like there's a lot of mechanical stuff that can really throw a launch off. You did a great job. You built what customers are really excited about, process are really excited about, but you can't get it off the ground because all this other stuff, it's death from a thousand cuts of the small things it takes to actually deliver it to the customers.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're going to keep doing these. We're committed to the YouTube thing. So thanks for watching and listening. We're going to make this a series, the product strategy series. So if you have other questions, especially related to building products, running a better engineering organization, or just figuring out what comes next, we would love to hear them because we're building this thing as we go.
IBID, as we would say in a high school book report footnote.
Awesome. All right, Jim.
Good to see you
Good
too.
to see you.
Ciao for now.
Ciao for now.